Chapter 1. The gym door slammed behind Konstantin with a bang. Wearing only gray cotton shorts and a new pair of sneakers, he draped a towel around his glistening shoulders. They ached after the roughly 10 billion pull-ups he'd done in the hopes of burning off some of his pent-up rage. Exhaustion wasn't enough to keep his fists from balling and his teeth from clenching as he thought of the man who'd betrayed him, banishing him to this gilded prison. His definitely ex-boyfriend, Levin. Konstantin debated turning around for another hour or two of running on the indoor track behind him, though it would be equally futile in erasing the memory of the kingpin's wicked smirk or the impressive bulge from his fantasies, he was sure. Even now, despite everything, he missed that fucker. The thought of the danger Levin had put himself in, without anyone to watch his fine ass, made Konstantin sick. Nearly as queasy as the certainty that Levin hadn't believed Konstantin was worth keeping around for protection, or moral support, or the stress relief brought on by a killer blowjob. None of it had been enough. From beside him, where she'd been plastered since he'd arrived in America for the first time in his life, Karolina spoke in quiet Russian. "Do you want to stop by the kitchen for a sports drink? I could make some lunch for you, too." "Since when do you know how to cook, princess?" He sneered at the woman who'd been married, okay, more like enslaved, to Vladimir, the Mafia leader Levin had so recently replaced following the bastard's demise. Konstantin had seen poor Vlad's brains splattered on the ostentatious wallpaper of his and Karolina's bedroom, right before Konstantin had been booted from the compound in the custody of the do-gooder assassins who had become his jailers. It was fucked up how people could convince themselves that violence was righteous. He should know, since he'd done it too when he'd been a part of Vladimir's organization. Stealing a few cars from rich guys to pay for his little sister's nursing education hadn't seemed so terrible. It was all the stuff he'd gotten tangled up in afterward that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. Karolina hadn't earned his shitty attitude, nor did she take his bait. Instead, she offered him a wry smile. "I've figured out a few things, like slapping together a sandwich since I got here. Come on, you can't run on anger forever." "Watch me." It pulsed in him with a white-hot energy that kept him from feeling the other, way more painful things hidden at its core. Heartbreak, loneliness, abandonment, inferiority, dangerous emotions he had no intention of acknowledging. Still, he couldn't deny his stomach when it growled loudly enough to be heard over the foreign chatter echoing from the command center nearby. So when Karolina steered them toward the communal kitchen and dining hall across the lobby from the gym, he didn't fight her. As they passed the brain of the Shield's operation, with its glossy boardroom table surrounded by video conferencing equipment, fancy monitors, and big dudes, nervous excitement wafted into the empty halls of the assassin's headquarters. Anticipation bubbled up in the form of drumming fingers on the armrest of a chair, jokes meant to disperse nerves, and glances that flicked repeatedly to body cam footage from silent operatives lined up in tactical gear on a plane displayed across the main screen. Konstantin gritted his teeth and ignored the tug of familiarity. The Shield's motives might not have much in common with those of the criminals he'd been embroiled with before, who'd been about making money at any cost. But these agents had a lot of what he'd stupidly thought his organization would give him. Camaraderie, a place to belong, a higher purpose. So what if he'd also had to hide who he really was and the obviously misplaced love and lust he'd had for his commander? Oblivious to his turmoil, Karolina cheerily asked if he preferred ham and cheese, or if he wanted to try some weird combination of smashed up peanuts and jelly as she crossed the threshold to the kitchen. His steps slowed. When a pregnant hush fell in the room full of spies next door, every cell of Konstantin's body recognized the demand for attention. Well-honed instincts went on high alert. His pulse spiked higher than it had during the peak of his workout. His pupils dilated, and he snapped his head around before taking one step closer and then another toward the epicenter of the adrenaline factory he was confined within. It was all for nothing, though. He definitely did not work there. Konstantin was sitting out this and every other righteous shield's fight, and not by his own choice either. His badass lover had shipped him to an entirely different country, hell, continent, to make sure he'd been properly sidelined from the action. Kon? Carolina raised her brows and curled the manicured fingers of one hand to urge him into the kitchen instead of snooping on the mission in progress. Fuck that. If he couldn't play, he might as well watch. So what if it was torture? Some masochistic part of him hoped for a glimpse of Levin. If not to drool over the man, then to at least reassure himself that the asshole was still in one piece. Besides, the thought of being relegated to this well-meaning babysitter rankled. Sure, she was a familiar face and made a great interpreter when he was too irritated to remember the particular English words he needed to tell the Shields to fuck off. And fine, she'd been kinder than he deserved, given their roles in their previous lives. The truth of it was, though, that as surely as the Mafia had forced him to fight to survive when he'd been too young and dumb to know better, they'd thrown him away like the garbage he'd always known they would consider him if they discovered he wasn't quite as straight as he'd made it appear. He'd just never expected Levin to be the one to get rid of him. Carolina drifted closer and murmured, "You miss him, huh?" "Levin may have saved your life, Carolina, but he ruined mine." Which was why it pissed him off that he still gave a shit about what happened to the new head of their organization. "As much as I hated Vladimir, there was still some part of me that mourned when he died." "You mean when your new boyfriends murdered him?" Konstantin regretted the bitter accusation as soon as it flew from his lips. No matter how hard or how long he'd tried to fit in, he'd never been as cold-blooded as most of his associates. Carolina spun to leave. He reached out and clasped her wrist gently in his hand. Her eyes flew to him. Her lips parted on a gasp. Inside the command center, a chair rolled back from the table as Legend rose, glaring through the open doorway at the place where they were connected. Carolina flashed the larger of her mates a reassuring, if slightly wobbly, smile. "I'm sorry," Konstantin muttered. "You didn't deserve that, any of it." "I know." Carolina stood taller then. He wondered at how her time at Shields had transformed her. Maybe it wasn't all bad there. "And I forgive you. If we're quiet, they'll probably let us stay and watch. Sometimes I know things that can help, and you have a lot more insider info than me." Konstantin nodded. He released Carolina and held his hands up, palms out, chest high, as he strolled into the command center. Hopefully Legend could see he was no threat. The mountain of a man stared him down before sinking back into his chair. Tavish put his hand over Legend's from his place next to his partner and squeezed reassuringly, without taking his gaze from the mission unfolding on the screens surrounding them. No one else paid either the guy's protective bent or their personal bond any mind. What would it be like to be able to be that open without fear of recrimination? Konstantin figured he'd never know because Levin had wrecked him for anyone else. Despite the fact that he was surrounded by smoking hot men in his exile, exactly none of them had piqued his interest in the weeks he'd been there. In fact, the only person who had was visible on screen at that moment. A camera mounted high in the cockpit of the Shield's private jet showed Aven, with her eyes forward, while her hands flipped switches, pushed buttons, and steered the plane. She read descending numbers from one of the 10 million gauges surrounding her. Confident and fearless, she navigated the final approach into a private Russian airfield he instantly recognized as a rural drop-off point he'd manned plenty of times when shipments of weapons or drugs needed to be transported. What exactly were they up to? Taking supplies to Levin under the guise of a more sinister delivery? Or picking something up? Konstantin knew why they hadn't let it slip sooner that they were going. He would have found a way to smuggle himself onto their flight. Levin's instructions, be damned. He shifted his stare from the long, strawberry blonde mane of the Shield's pilot extraordinaire, Aven, who also happened to be his across-the-hall neighbor. Instead, he took in the man sitting at the head of the command center table 15 feet away. Jordan was tall, with dark, close-cropped hair and wise eyes that had begun to crinkle at their corners. Their gazes locked, and Konstantin braced himself to be sent away, yet again. Instead, Jordan tapped his chin a few times, then glanced at his team manager, James. The guy smiled before nodding at his boss. Jordan turned back to Konstantin. He shrugged, then promptly ignored Konstantin in favor of monitoring the activities going on half a world away. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but Kon would take it. Carolina nudged him toward 2 empty seats at the end of the table, beside the tanned man everyone called Cash. Though Kon had tried not to give a fuck, figuring out the dirt on his abductors was the first step in gaining leverage to break free. From what he'd gathered, he was pretty sure Cash was attached to the group's sniper, Arav, and one of their female agents, Sola, who could scale the rock-climbing wall in the gym twice as fast as any of the men on the team. Despite his best efforts at disdain, she, and her guys, had impressed the hell out of Konstantin. It seemed like they also included the blonde medic and the 2 agents she lived with, Knox and Marcus, on tonight's team. It hadn't taken Konstantin long to realize they definitely had some unusual living arrangements in the Shield's headquarters, and even the rest of this backwoods town, if the other friends that dropped by on occasion were any indication. Ruby, their computer geek, tapped away at her station, adding 2 tiny windows with feeds containing the body cam footage from her boyfriends, Ace and Liam, to her personal screen. If anyone else noticed, they didn't call her on it. Konstantin knew from experience that running jobs with someone you slept with added both the possibility for deadly distraction and also a closeness that could be a competitive advantage when it came to making split-second decisions in the field. It seemed to be working out better for the Shields than it had for him and Levin. "That's because he never truly trusted you." Kon scrubbed his hand over his face, as if it would wipe the errant thought from his mind. How had he let Levin down? What else could he have done to prove he was worthy to be used by the kingpin instead of a tool broken enough to be discarded? The ground rushed up to meet the Shield's jet. Flashing white lights periodically illuminated the landing strip as it grew closer and closer. The wheels of the plane kissed the pavement, which wasn't in the greatest of condition. Even so, the camera hardly jiggled as Aven glided down the runway, bringing them to a stop. As soon as she did, a flurry of motion followed. Not chaos. No, this was the precision movement of a luxury watch like the one Levin prized. Sola took the lead, opening the door and charging down the stairs into enemy territory, cloaked in night. Arav was right behind her, a mean rifle slung across his chest. They trotted into the darkness and vanished, as Marcus and Knox spread out in the other direction. That left Ace and Liam to greet the small contingent of men waiting on the fringes of the shadows. Konstantin leaned forward, squinting. He was almost sure. His guts clenched, and it had nothing to do with the fact that he was starving. Or at least, not for food. Levin looked like shit. But that didn't stop Konstantin from getting stiff at the sight of him. Great. Now bailing wasn't an option, unless he wanted to show the rest of the team what he was hiding under their boardroom table. Dark circles under Levin's eyes and the tense clench of his jaw made Kon wish he was there to help the man relax properly. How long could he keep this charade up by himself? Konstantin figured it was no coincidence that some of the strongest, but not so bright, men were the ones Levin had chosen to load heavy-looking crates into the cargo hold of Aven's jet in exchange for sleek, black, hard plastic boxes. "You're giving him more tech?" Konstantin didn't mean to say it out loud, but he was glad he had when Jordan confirmed it. Yeah, we need copies of all his hard drives and camera footage. The more info we can strip out of there, the more ammunition we have to shut the whole thing down. And what are you taking in exchange? Cold hard cash wouldn't occupy as much space as those boxes were capable of holding, nor would it be as dense as whatever was in them. Besides, what could they have that the shields wanted? Weren't they supposed to be different than the usual gun runners? 10 men. It's getting too risky to keep them over there. Jordan didn't take his eyes off the action. Huh? Konstantin looked to James instead. What was he missing? The Mafia weren't the sort to take prisoners. They were far more ruthless, making sure their enemies could never threaten them again, at least after they'd forced them to talk by any means necessary. Your guy has been protecting some agents from other European countries who were made. He spared their lives and hid them away instead of taking them out like he made it seem. He's also rounded up some higher-ups from rival organizations who were dispatched to challenge him after Vladimir, disappeared. They're very valuable witnesses, an asset we can't afford to lose. James answered with a wince. Neither he nor Jordan seemed to understand what cost Levin would pay if he was caught. Or rather, the men probably didn't care, like Konstantin did, despite his best efforts. His cock deflated. He's not mine, but you're going to get Levin killed. Terror and grief threatened to drown Konstantin. It was bad enough that Levin had let him go. It was unbearable to think about him not being out there, somewhere, even if Konstantin couldn't have him. Always a possibility in our line of work. Jordan didn't try to bullshit him, which somehow soothed him more than if the guy had been oblivious to the hazard. But we're doing everything we can to avoid that. Konstantin shot to his feet and paced behind the table. There was nothing he could do to prevent it from there. Almost nothing. He crossed to Ruby's station and scanned through some of the alternate views of the surrounding areas along routes he'd traveled on nights not so different from this one. Nolan tensed, as if preparing to stop Konstantin from interfering, even if doing so messed up his perfect action figure hairdo. Relax. Konstantin only intended to help. Not them, but Levin, because apparently he couldn't help himself from repeating his past mistakes. Let me take a look. I've manned this site in the past. There would be plenty of time to kick his own ass for his misplaced loyalty later. Konstantin was close enough that he got a very clear view of Levin's handsome-as-fuck face when he approached the plane and jogged up the stairs to speak with Aven. Levin's eyes widened while he scanned her body, like he often did to Kon before devouring him. Oh, really? Konstantin's stomach dropped. He couldn't blame Levin for being attracted to a woman as gorgeous as her, but it did make him wonder. How much time had he spent with the sexy pilot during his own time at Shields? You good? Levin asked Aven, lingering a moment too long to be impartial. When he tucked an errant strand of Aven's hair behind her ear, Kon froze. Maybe there had been another reason his boyfriend had dumped him, one he hadn't suspected, which had nothing to do with his job performance. After all, while Levin asked how Aven was doing, he didn't so much as make a peep about Kon. Did that seem odd to anyone else? Or had only he been dumb enough to believe Levin had been into more than stretching Kon's mouth or his ass around his fat cock? Fine. Aven didn't seem to notice the intensity of Levin's attention. Let's get the cargo loaded quick. Something about this crosswind is putting me on edge. Are the conditions right to leave on schedule? Levin asked, staring around as if he could see the wind. I can fly in anything. Aven crossed her arms, making the most of her pert tits. Konstantin didn't begrudge Levin noticing, his gaze flicking to her chest before he spun away. Cancel the refueling. We have plenty to reach the layover where we'll bring our guests upstairs. No offense, but I don't want to stay any longer than we have to. Konstantin frowned as the thud of crates hitting the cargo hold thundered through the microphones. They couldn't transport people all the way back to the States like that. Of course, she'd have to make another stop to get them out and fill up her tanks for the long flight home. He gritted his teeth, biting down on the urge to ask Levin to get on that plane with the shields. Despite the errors Kon had made in judgment, he was certain Levin would refuse to leave until he'd seen this insanity through to the end. It hurt too much to look at the man, to witness him suffering in silence, and to wonder who he was going to replace Konstantin with. If it hadn't already been Aven, it might have been anyone else by then. Instead, Kon concentrated on the darkness, because he knew the location of the back roads he'd taken during similar operations. He was able to spot a hint of movement on the fringes of the property long before anyone else thought to look for it. He pointed to the disturbance. "You have company." Jordan frowned, then tapped his comms. "Levin, you have a team to the west? I thought we'd agreed only to those on the tarmac." "Not my guys." Levin spun from Aven. He leapt down to the pavement, shook his head, then evaluated the progress of the transfer. 4 crates to go. "You'll have to stop," Konstantin said to Jordan, then to James. "Get everyone out of there." "Keep going." Jordan doomed them all. "Speed things up." Konstantin felt like someone had punched him in the gut. He doubled over and braced his hands on his knees. This wasn't going to end well. And worse, did that mean someone suspected Levin wasn't the evil mastermind he'd pretended to be? Or was this a simple case of an upstart testing the waters after a power shift, looking for an opportunity to grab some for themselves? Neither was good. Jordan barked commands. "Arv, Sola, take out the unwanted visitors. They're about 100 yards behind you, across the stream." Konstantin tapped the monitor, tracing the path Jordan had indicated. "If they go that way, they'll be trapped. Look, there are more coming here. Tell your sniper to circle around to the red barn on his right. It's never locked. There's a loft he'll be able to pick anyone off from until the jet's loaded." Jordan snapped his stare to Konstantin's. If he was lying, people would die. Their agents. His ex-lover. But he wasn't, and if they didn't listen to him in the next few seconds, the gap would close. "I swear on Levin's safety." Jordan tapped the comm at his ear and directed the team. "Change of plans. That route won't work. Go through the barn. Arv, you can set up in the loft and pick them off as they cross the runway." Sparks tingled in Konstantin's veins. He'd be lying if he said he hadn't missed this. The same rush he'd only ever gotten from a good hard fuck or fight. And since it seemed like the first source of his highs was going to be in short supply in the near future, maybe he could contribute to the shields. Not because he thought there was a future for him and Levin. He promised himself. Rather, because it was the least he could do, to make up for the shit he'd gotten too deep in to back out of when he realized he was hurting more than other bad guys. The pop of gunshots rang through the otherwise silent command center. Konstantin braced himself. It wasn't Levin who fell to the ground covered in blood, though it easily could have been if Kon hadn't spotted the rogue attackers. Instead, bodies dropped on the edges of the airstrip. "Go inside. Get ready to take off," Levin shouted to Aven, though she was already in motion. She bolted so fast that she clipped the edge of her cockpit door with her shoulder hard enough to shake the camera above her. Outside, Levin scrambled to the crew and hefted one of the crates by himself, shoving it into the hold before snagging the largest black case from the shields. He put it on his shoulder, then sprinted for his vehicle. Konstantin's stare followed Levin until he disappeared behind the slammed driver's door. His men followed his example, completing their transfer as the shields lived up to their name. The agents quickly and efficiently neutralized the threat, then ushered Levin's men to their caravan. Ace slapped the trunk of Levin's car twice, as if it were a horse he was goading into a gallop. Tires squealed, and it took off, racing into the night. The shields barreled onto the plane, the engines of which were already winding up, as Sola locked the door behind them. It felt like an hour, but was only a few held breaths before Aven launched them into the sky. Konstantin stood there, statue still, fists clenched and his sore muscles tensed, for the 20 much longer minutes it took Levin to race through the city to his compound. Eventually, Levin heaved a sigh that Konstantin felt on the other side of the world. We made it. No one followed us. Konstantin sagged, dropping slowly to his knees where he fought for air, harder than he had in the gym, until James crossed to him and helped him up. Thank you. Jordan joined them, clapping him on the shoulder. My team would have been in trouble if not for you. I know this isn't what you wanted, but I'm glad you were here today. I don't intend to make this a habit. Konstantin turned to leave, annoyed with himself for how damn good it felt to be appreciated, and how easily they could use that to manipulate him. Part of him panicked, desperate to be away from the temptation of opening up to them, when he came down from the rush of even his tangential involvement when he'd have to face everything he'd lost. You could if you wanted to. Jordan backed off, but the offer lingered out there. We can always use more help. Don't forget, I didn't choose to flip sides. Sometimes life makes those decisions for us, and we only realize later that it was for the best. James grinned at him. Besides, you don't have to break loyalty at all. You'd still be on Team Levin, just under new management. How else are you going to make sure that fine man of yours stays in one piece? I told you, he's not mine anymore. Probably never was. Konstantin shot the guy the finger, then strode from the room, remembering the steamy stare Levin had leveled at Aven. For the first time since Konstantin had arrived, Carolina wasn't close on his heels. Had he earned a bit of the Shield's trust? A little more freedom? He hoped so. It would make it easier to escape.
You can listen to the rest of the book in the Tempt Romance audiobooks app, available on the App Store and Google Play. The link to the book is in the description. Discover even more bestsellers and exclusive stories updated weekly, only in Tempt Romance audiobooks.